Hi, I'm Jake, and today we're continuing the multi-part Death Guard series where we'll be discussing the more advanced decisions made during list building. Welcome to part 3 of the 9th edition competitive Death Guard video series. If you haven't seen part 1 or 2, which covered the general overview and top unit choices, feel free to check those out first. If you've already seen those, then thanks so much for returning back to check this one out. There's a ton of information to go over considering the variety of choices we have access to when it comes to Warlord traits, relics, play companies, and etc, etc. But I'll be pointing these out by category as they appear in our codex and highlighting what I've experienced to be the best choices in a combination format rather than on an individual basis, which in my opinion lacks context of how things properly function. Please do keep in mind this is a competitive Warhammer video series, so don't hate me for only outlining optimal choices, which I've discovered. There certainly are a multitude of varieties that we can take as Death Guard. Firstly, let's talk about fundamental army compositions which set the direction of what appeals to you the most. Keep in mind that during list building, that disease minion and infernal jealousy rules exist, which may limit what you had planned out, so just make sure not to forget that part. Alright, let's kick it off. Terminator heavy builds are the new hotness right now, and it's completely justified. Depending on your local meta, they can be an absolute nightmare for opponents to remove, let alone go to toe with in melee. Typically, I like to go for on the heavier side for Blight Lords for their utility, and then paired with about 3 to 9 Death Shroud models, points permitting of course. Infantry spam builds consist of leaning heavily into Poxwalkers and Plague Marines primarily, but can also be supported with Terminators as well and even Cultists. If this kind of build appeals to your playstyle, it really is worth considering. A lot of people have a lot of success with it, as have I. A hybrid of vehicles and troops is my personal preference, but you do have to be careful of your overall selections to ensure your army is built and supported cohesively. Keyword, cohesively. And then there's lastly what I like to call Mortarion and Friends. Yes, it most certainly can keep up in the current meta. However, it is my least suggested competitive build, due to mainly how easily he is able to be countered. The flip side is, if your opponent absolutely doesn't know how to deal with Morty, he's going to slay nearly everything that walks in his path, or that he walks into their path. Alright, so next up are Plague Companies. If your army's battle-forged, keyword Plague Company units, in Death Guard detachments gain access to Plague Company rules. This does mean that some select units, such as Cultists, don't gain these benefits, so do keep an eye out. There's not many. I think it might actually only be Cultists, but just keep an eye out for that. Harbingers has gained some popularity, primarily due to the Terminus S formation, which recently came out, which means no vehicles. If you're into using your Poxwalkers as a hammer, though, this one's for you. Just make sure you're going into the build with no less than 60 Poxwalkers to make it worthwhile. And in this case, Typhus is a great HQ choice. As you probably know, he buffs your mindless zombies. The Inexorable, which happens to be my go-to for 2 reasons really, both the -2 to charge roll stratagem as well as the Ferric Blight relic, which improves AP by 1 for enemy units within contagion range of the relic bearer. I usually put this on my Lord Contagion since he has that innate 3-inch addition to his contagion effects. I find that if you have a shooting heavy build supported by a melee blob marching forward, this is really one that you should consider. The relic is pretty good as well if you have vehicles like drones or dreadnoughts backing up your close combat units, which can be healed by the relic holder. Mortarion's Anvil finds its way into a lot of lists these days as well. For only 1 CP, being able to heroically intervene with any number of units is extremely defensive. The Warlord trait Gloaming Boat works really well. Works beautifully actually on surgical units such as Mortarion or even a buffed up Demon Prince, which just basically shuts down Overwatch as well as any rerolls that your enemy has access to. Placement and timing is key when taking this Plague Company to ensure you maximize the capability without leaving your units exposed. Now, the Wretched has its place for heavier casting builds, but at the end of the day, we're Nurgle and not Tzeentch. I don't find myself taking this one anytime soon, despite its fairly reliable mortal wound and casting output. The Poxmonger's Company, not to be confused with the Amazeball rendition, was from the obsolete Psychic Awakening. Sorry. Pretty much very mediocre buffs all the way around. This might be the worst choice we have. I guess you could argue that you gain more benefits from other Plague companies, even when leading into a heavier vehicle build. The Ferryman is a really interesting choice. Being able to extend the range of an aura ability by 6 inches for 1 CP, and the Warlord trait having an enemy movement while within Contagion does also take some surgical skill to pull off properly, but then again, what good thing does it? If you build around this one, just make sure, again, you're not leaving your key units exposed just to take advantage of the Plague Company's mechanics. Just be careful. And then lastly, Mortarian's Chosen Sons doesn't seem to be a top choice by many, myself included, but I do plan to build a list around this very soon. It makes Flamers straight up bonkers, but it does require you to get up a little bit closer to your enemy to set it up right. It certainly helps that our Flamers are now 12-inch range, but also keep in mind that it's not Plague Spitters. It's the only Flamer that's not included. If you're interested in this build, you'll want to ensure plenty of Marines and Terminators with the appropriate loadouts. And you can also have a lot of fun flanking with Deep Strike, since you can get your Termies into position and into the fight quite easily. All right, now let's talk about stratagems. I won't be going over each one since there's a lot, as you know, but by now you should have a better idea of how I suggest choosing your army composition first, and then matching it with a Plague company of your choice before even considering the rest of the more nuanced decisions that we'll be covering. For your close combat Marines specifically, Trench Fighters, Haze of Corruption, and Eternal Hatred should really be a combo to consider. Use one or all situationally, since it can cost you up to 5 CP, but there isn't much you won't be able to take down using this. However, it's just bananas if you pop it all off with the right build and support. And Haze of Corruption works plenty fine on Blight Lords too, with multiple flails, of course, to actually take advantage of the spillover if you're attempting to clear off some hordes. Now, if you happen to not wipe whatever your target is and still engaged with into your next shooting phase, you can also use the Blightning for 1 CP, which turns 3 of your Marines' grenades to become a flat 6 auto-hitting pistol profile. Yummy. Next up, if you run any Poxwalkers at all, make sure not to forget Mutant Strain. I've used this every single game, period. Even a 10-man can lick off reliable mortal wounds at the expense of losing a couple Poxwalkers here and there by rolling unmodified 1s. But it's usually worth it. I want to say the most I've generated was about 12 mortal wounds from a 20-man squad, given an above average roll, of course, on my side. But this strat is in addition to normal damage. It's just MVP. So this segues into the Dead Walk Again stratagem, which I find and use every single game. You roll 7d6 for every 3 up, you return a slain Poxwalker back into the unit. Not only can you set these units up into engagement range, but there's also nothing barring you from daisy chaining your conga line to gain further movement than when you started. It's a movement hack. So let's think about this for a second. Poxwalkers already revive slain models for every model that they kill naturally. Then you have this strat that you can use to bring up to up to 7 Poxwalkers back in your next hero phase. It's insanely disruptive and should be seen in a way to gain extra movement from the slow 4-inch movements profile that they have. All right, so this one's a really interesting combo that I figured out. Let's say you want a really high threat target dropped and your list doesn't contain any tanks for long-range example, as a long-range example. So we're going to start with Virulent Rounds, which lets you apply a core unit with bolt weapons, so now their bolter shots turn into plague weapons. And then next you use Sickly Corrosion for 2 CP, and all you need to do is land a hit against your target. After that, the rest of your army targeting that same enemy unit with or without a plague weapon, they will be able to re-roll 1s to wound. I love using Sickly Corrosion to support my Volkite Contemptors specifically, where I'm fishing for 6s to wound anyway, so being able to re-roll just even several 1s can be extremely helpful. It's the difference between life and death on one enemy unit. The last stratagem I want to highlight is Unclean Machine Spirits. It is worth mentioning since a lot of people do run Plague Burst Crawlers, and knowing that you have a way to fire at full health ballistic skill right when you need it to can definitely come in handy. We have so many other stratagems that come in handy, so I will strongly encourage you to review them on your own to see what works best for your own goals. This summary isn't the end-all, they just happen to be my favorites, which I've had the most success with on the tabletop. Now, Deadly Pathogens. This is a really interesting yet also not a surprising addition to the Death Guard Codex, since Space Marines also previewed a very similar mechanic. You really don't need to consider pathogens, but if you want to give some characters or champions extra punching power, this is definitely going to be the way to do so without spending CP for relics. Not to mention, if you have 10 to 20 points left over and not sure where to plug them, I highly suggest consider to spend them here. I really like Virulent Fever for Death Shroud champions, since you're getting 10 swings on the scythe profile from him. You get a fairly decent chance of generating a couple mortal wounds here, and certainly more if you have hit rerolls. Viscous Death is also a good one to take on either your Lord of Virulence or your Foul Blight spawn, considering it's only 10 points to preserve your CP during the game, and be able to reroll the dreaded unreliability of rolling for flamer shots. The rest have their place. Just check and see what might work for you and how many points you have left over. But that's exactly where I place Pathogens overall. It's if you have the points to spare. For Warlord traits, my favorite combinations are Hulking Physique or Rotten Constitution on HQ, such as a Demon Prince or our Lords. Especially the latter trait being highly useful against -1 and -2 AP ignoring armies, such as Sisters. And Arch Contaminator also works great for me when putting it on a support character, more like the Foul Blight spawn. Since you're already throwing him up closer into the action for his own innate abilities, but obviously you can put him on a more durable character. I just find that this one just is better suited for someone slightly behind the front line. The other three are pretty juicy too, well, maybe except for Foul Effluence. I'm just not really a big fan. So again, see what works best for you, and if you found a way to really make this work, let me know in the comments below. Now let's talk about relics, which, as you probably already know, are far more important than deadly pathogens. You actually can build your army around what kind of support your characters are providing, and I'm going to start by talking about the Tollkeeper relic. The Tallyman's already an auto take for me, just for the CP generation alone, but since I'm already taking him, why not throw on this awesome relic which generate additional shots from core units? For example, Volkite Contemptors, I do like Volkite Contemptors, really shouldn't be running your Death Guard army without the Tollkeeper relic. Yes, it's that good, and yes, I usually net positive on my number of shots after reroll buffs and tallying and so on and so forth. If you're already taking the Foul Blight spawn, you should be taking a Revolting Stench Vats. His innate always fight last ability is great, but having a 6-inch aura where no enemy counts as charging allows you to really control close combat during the game. Totally worth it. You can shut down pretty much everything like Blood Angels have, even Space Wolves, so on and so forth. I also really do like the Plaguebringer relic to put on a Blightlord Terminator champion, equipped with a Bale Sword, but I probably don't use it enough, admittedly. This one gives the -3 AP Bale Sword extra strength and extra damage, and also counts slain models as 2 for morale test purposes. You can pair this one with the -4 leadership strat that we have access to for Termies for a nice bomb your enemy's morale test when it's needed. Alright, so let's wrap relics up. Other ones to consider notably are Fulgurious Helm to extend range aura ranges and Separating Plate to add that extra durability primarily for Demon Princes, or even Reaper of Glorious Entropy has its place, which I like to put on Lord of Contagion. They can really make your characters shine. Alright, moving on to Contagion disciplines for your casters. Spells, aka spells. Miasma Pestilence and either Plague Wind or Curse of the Leper are my go-tos, and I put those on my Malignant Playcaster usually. It's a really easy decision on the latter two, meaning if you're going up against a horde, take Plague Wind. But if there's more MSU or if you're fighting a more elite army, you'll want to take Curse of the Leper. Putrescent Vitality is also always a good choice, but I do find myself using it less and less since the difference between toughness 5 to 6 or going from 8 to 9 doesn't come up nearly as much as you'd think. And the last 3 choices in this category are also situational as well, so just keep that in mind when deciding on which spells to cast and to take. Alrighty, we've just covered essentially the entire codex during this video series from a competitive play perspective, so thanks for hanging on with me for this long. Now let's talk about the basic, and yes, I do mean basic, as I do plan on covering more specific content down the road, but the basic fundamental strategy on how you might tie all of this information in together when you're hitting the tabletop with your Death Guard. Firstly, no matter what and which route you've chosen, you'll want to make sure that your units are supported so they're not always overextended and exposed. always keep in mind that our units are far from invincible, no matter how good things look on paper. Just try not to fall into that trap. We have a lot of tools to boost survivability, but many top competitive armies can really drown us in shots or have other ways to remove Death Guard. Always remember that as strong as Death Guard are, there are clear crutches we have to work around in order to come out ahead in the game. Knowing and admitting your army's weak points will make you a stronger general to know which decisions to make and when to make them. The way I personally see Death Guard is we exist to score, and we score very reliably, and are also gifted with tools to contest even the strongest opponents. What that really means is we're not necessarily the hardest hitting army by any measure, but we have the ability to absorb a ton of hits. The moral of the story, don't take the hits just because you can. A good example is that Terminators having that natural ability to deep strike doesn't mean that you always should. I mean, it's tempting, but you shouldn't always. Always read the board and your opponent as well when choosing to do so. Because deep striking units means that those points you paid for are off the board for at least one turn. And you'll need clear windows on when to drop in to kill whatever you're trying to kill, or when to drop in to score or deny scoring. Just think twice about a lot of things. And this is just one example of making sure you are considering your options rather than using the same tactic or strategy every single game without considering your matchup. Don't be afraid to switch things up, and just don't try to fit square pegs into a round hole. It's not going to work. Lastly, the best advice I can provide is take a moment to consider which army composition speaks to you the most. If you think your playstyle leans more towards close combat, I'm willing to bet you're going to find more success with a melee-oriented build rather than a shooting build. It's just kind of a golden rule in my opinion. Simply put, if you don't like the way a certain army build functions, it's not going to work out as well. Not one compared to a build that you're actually personally excited about. Well, that's it for today, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you found this video to be helpful or informative by any measure and would like to see more content like this, please stay subscribed and join in on the conversation in the comments below. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.